The most important new name among the teams that would compete in Formula One in 1970 was March. Not only was there a March factory team with cars driven by New Zealander Chris Amon and Switzerland's Joe Siffert, but there were also 3 private teams running similar cars. As the cars and drivers arrived at Kyalami for the first race of the season, everyone was wondering how the newcomers would perform. Most important among the independent March teams was Tyrrell. That would compete in Formula One in 1970 was March. Not only was there a March factory team with cars driven by New Zealander Chris Amon and Switzerland's Joe Siffert, but there were also 3 private teams running similar cars. As the cars and drivers arrived at Kyalami for the first race of the season, everyone was wondering how the newcomers would perform. Most important among the independent March teams was Tyrrell, which would be bidding to help Jackie Stewart retain his championship. Alongside Jackie at Tyrrell was Johnny Servoz-Gavin, a French driver capable of flashes of brilliance. Matra was now an all-French team with drivers Jean-Pierre Beltoise and Henri Pescarolo. McLaren, with 1967 champion Denny Hulme, was a potential winner, but March, even though it had Mario Andretti as one of its independent drivers alongside Amon and Siffert, was an unknown quantity. Not so Brabham, which could call on the experience of its founder and the local knowledge of Peter de Klerk. 1968 champion Graham Hill drove Rob Walker's Lotus, while Belgian Jackie Ickx was the only Ferrari in the field. BRM had Pedro Rodriguez and a new designer, Tony Southgate. As practice progressed, it became clear just how much the young March organisation had achieved. Stewart and Amon were on the front row of the grid with equal times, just 0.3 of a second faster than Jack Brabham, whose car was also brand new. The fact that Bruce McLaren, 10th on the grid, was just a second slower than the leading pair shows just how competitive the field was. Denny Hulme, McLaren's teammate, had been world champion in 1967. But last year, in '69, he was 6th in the table. When practice ended, he was 6th on the grid. In the championship, 6th is disappointing. On the grid, it's more encouraging. At the start, Brabham was hindered and dropped to 6th, while the 2 Jackies, Stewart and Ickx, took the advantage. Ickx soon dropped back, but the Scot held the lead until lap 20, when he was passed by the 44-year-old Brabham in the first monocoque car to be built by his team. Black Jack, as he was called, didn't rush to embrace new technology, but his carefulness, combined with driving skill, certainly paid off. As usual, Kyalami provided excellent weather for the race. The clouds, so typical of high country in Africa, provided a spectacular backdrop to the action, while the breeze kept the temperature at a comfortable level. This was always one of the more pleasant F1 venues. 30 years ago, it provided an unstressed opening to the season, allowing teams to play themselves in gently. As is so often the case in the first race of the year, there were plenty of retirements. 2 out of the 3 BRMs dropped out, and 12 of the 25 starters weren't around to see the checkered flag. Jack Brabham, however, did see the flag. Driving steadily, he led home Denny Hulme's McLaren by just 8 seconds. Stewart was 3rd, but the only other march to finish was that of Siffert, back in 10th place. The march was fast and competitive, but the design was more 1969 than 1970. Ken Tyrrell was already thinking of an alternative. In May, the Grand Prix Caravan came to rest in Monte Carlo, where stars like Kirk Douglas were happy to hang out with the drivers and the autograph hunters were in heaven. Before the race could start, the drivers had to be marshalled for a mass presentation to Prince Rainier and Princess Grace. By the sound of it, the proceedings were under the command of a trained seal. But even that didn't stop Princess Caroline from being bored. As the field of 16 cars howled away from the start and up the hill towards Casino Square, Jackie Stewart was in the lead. Since South Africa, the cars had raced in Spain, and Jackie had given the March its first win. It was a race of attrition, however, and only 5 cars had finished. It was to be hoped that here, in front of the most prestigious crowd and the biggest TV audience of the year, the race would be closer. For the first third of the race, Stewart looked as though he could repeat his success in Spain. As the blue car swept through all the famous landmarks of the Monaco circuit, the reigning champion looked completely at ease. Jackie's most serious threat came from Jack Brabham, who had passed Eamon, whose March had held an early second place after 20 laps. The Matras were going well here, and Henri Pescarolo, who'd started 8th, was moving steadily through the field. As the time passed, the rigours of the circuit took their toll. Jackie Oliver's BRM suffered an engine failure, and around the circuit the marshals were dealing with dropped oil. Graham Hill had made good progress after swapping cars and starting from the back of the grid. He'd climbed into the top 6 and was chasing Hull. After 27 of the 80 laps, Stewart stopped in the pits for attention to his engine's electronics. He rejoined the race, but his wife Helen's lap chart no longer showed him as a potential winner. Brabham was now in the lead, while behind him, a young Swede called Ronnie Peterson, in another March, was lying 7th in his first Grand Prix. Hill and Pescarolo were now well in the points, but Brabham looked a certain winner, ahead of Eamon and Jochen Rindt, who'd steadily worked his way through the field from 7th on the grid. Then Eamon dropped out when his suspension failed. The veteran Australian was now in a perfect position, although the young Lotus driver was pressing him hard. Then the unbelievable happened. As Brabham approached the very last corner of the race, the gasworks hairpin, he misjudged his braking and buried the nose of his car in the straw bales. Rindt slipped past to win, while Black Jack hurriedly reversed out to take the flag for second. Rindt was the winner, however, and Colin Chapman's leap of joy said it all. The fourth race of the year was the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. There was a new face at Ferrari, Giunti, alongside Ickx on his home ground, but the rest of the field had changed little. Joe Siffert was in his March, as was Chris Amon. Pedro Rodriguez BRM was timed by his fiancée Glenda, while Nina Rindt had her watches on Jochen at Lotus. While Eamon talked tyres, Piers Courage was alone with his thoughts, as was Ronnie Peterson. The Spa track was very fast, and theoretically the V12 engined cars like Pedro Rodriguez BRM should have had an advantage. But the front row of the grid was all Cosworth, comprising Stewart, Rindt and Eamon, ahead of Ickx, the first V12 runner, and Brabham. Piers Courage, in the De Tomaso run by Frank Williams, was trying a new fighter pilot helmet. But Jochen Rindt hadn't even had time to get his new Bell Star painted. As practice ended and start time approached, there were more important things than painting the helmet to consider. Race day was fine, and apart from an official who seemed to forget where he was, the start was perfect. Rindt led into Eau Rouge, the daunting first corner, but at the end of the first lap, after 8 3/4 miles of racing over one of the world's greatest circuits, it was Eamon in the lead, followed by Stewart, Rodriguez, Rindt, Ickx, Beltoise, Brabham, Oliver, Peterson, Pescarolo, Courage, Giunti, Stommelen and Siffert. Stewart led the second lap from Eamon, Rindt and Rodriguez, but by lap 3 the New Zealander was ahead again. By now, Eamon was being harried by Rodriguez, and soon the power of the BRM paid off. The fiery Mexican had raced here just 3 weeks before in a Porsche 917 sports car and had lapped at a speed of over 160 miles per hour, 10 seconds a lap faster than the new lap record Eamon was to establish in this race. The Grand Prix circuit had a small chicane inserted in it in response to the driver's safety considerations. But Pedro's time was still an amazing achievement. Drivers like Giunti and Peterson, caught out by the slippery hairpin at La Source, could only blush at the comparison. Rolf Stommelen in the second Brabham was up to 5th place, but in the pits, as BRM signalled 3 laps to go, Jackie Stewart was back in civilian clothes, having retired after 15 laps. It was BRM's first victory for 4 years, and it was an encouraging result for the team's new young chassis designer, Tony Southgate. And with 4 races, each won by a different driver, it meant the championship was very evenly balanced. At Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix, there were a number of new faces. François Sever had joined the Tyrrell team after Johnny Servoz-Gavin had suddenly decided at Monaco that Formula One was not for him. America's Dan Gurney, chatting with Graham Hill, was in Holland for the worst possible reason. Just 2 weeks previously, Bruce McLaren, founder of McLaren Cars, had died while testing a Can-Am car. To make things worse, Denny Hulme had crashed at Indianapolis and burned his hands so severely that he couldn't drive. The McLarens were therefore driven by Gurney and Peter Gethin. The third McLaren was being driven by John Surtees, who'd formed his own team and was in the process of building his own car. There was a new man at Ferrari too. Swiss driver Clay Regazzoni was backing up team leader Jackie Ickx. There was also an important new car, the Lotus 72. It was a radical design, unlike any of the cars that were practicing alongside it. The traditional front-mounted radiator had been replaced by 2, set one on either side of the driver. This gave the car a dart-like profile that hid 2 other important innovations: inboard brakes and suspension by torsion bars rather than the almost universal coil springs. Despite a minor accident in practice, Jochen Rindt put the brand new car on pole position, and he set the other team's designers thinking very hard. As the pre-race skydivers packed up their parachutes and the start flag was prepared, everyone was wondering whether the new Lotus would live up to its qualifying performance. Stewart and Ickx were beside Rindt on the front row, and as the field, minus Eamon, whose clutch had failed, erupted across the line, it was the Ferrari that took the lead. Behind the leading cars, Piers Courage was engaged in a spirited battle with Miles in the second Lotus, the Matras of Beltoise and Pescarolo, Brabham, Siffert and Surtees. Courage, in the Red de Tomaso, was driving in a manner that lived up to his name, racing against better-funded rivals. But then, on lap 23, the spectators were shocked to see a pall of smoke rising from the back of the circuit. Joe Siffert, whose engine had failed, walked back looking solemn, and the word spread through the pits and paddock that Courage, one of the last of the gentleman racers, was dead. It was a bitter blow, but the race had to go on, although the drivers who'd driven past the scene of the accident had little stomach for the pursuit of Rindt, who'd taken the lead on lap 3. It was hard to concentrate on the job in hand, but Jochen Rindt closed his mind to the loss of a close friend and drove smoothly and precisely to bring the Lotus 72 home to its maiden victory. But this was a win that brought no joy, and on the podium, which Rindt shared with Stewart and Ickx, there was applause for the winner, but he was in no mood for celebration. The 1970 French Grand Prix was held among the pleasant hilly surroundings of the Charade circuit close to Clermont-Ferrand. It was the last of the circuits to utilise normal public roads, and as such it was a throwback to the past. Denny Hulme was back among the familiar faces on pit lane, wearing heavy gloves to protect his burned hands, which were still painful. This was the 6th of 13 races, and the field was now more or less constant. There were still newcomers, however, in this case a McLaren powered by an Alfa Romeo V8 engine driven by Andrea Diademic. The Italian qualified 15th and was no threat to the Cosworth brigade. If there was a threat, it was coming from the V12 powered cars. BRM, Matra and Ferrari were all improving as the season progressed, and Matra had real possibilities of a win on its home ground. The Ford Cosworth V8s were far from outclassed, however, and although Ickx and Beltoise made up the front row of the grid with their V12 powered Ferrari and Matra cars, Cosworths powered the next 4 fastest qualifiers: Eamon, Stewart, Brabham and Rindt. Pescarolo's Matra was 7th. In the days before refuelling rigs, the equipment was much simpler, but the effort required to fit and strip racing tyres is still the same today, as is the spit and polish. The start at Clermont-Ferrand, with a downhill run into a left-hand corner, was always spectacular, as was the typically French straight section that followed it. Here the V12s could show all their power, The early part of the race was dominated by Ickx and Beltoise, with Stewart holding on to third place. But after 5 laps, the Scot was forced into the pits with a problem in the black box that controlled engine electronics that were advanced for 1970, but which would be simpler than those on a family car of today. When he re-entered, Jackie was in 18th place, with a hard task ahead of him. Ickx led until lap 14 when he dropped out with a damaged valve in the Ferrari's engine. Beltoise was now in prime position, a French driver in a French car leading the French Grand Prix. Sadly, it wasn't to last, and on lap 25 he had to pit with a puncture. This left Rindt in first place ahead of Eamon. In the pits, Ken Tyrrell was watching Stewart's progress as Ronnie Peterson came in with a broken gearbox on his march. As the finish approached, Brabham was third ahead of Hulme, while Rindt kept Eamon at bay. As the flag fell, the Austrian took his third win of the season and went into the lead of the World Championship with 27 points. Second equal was Stewart and Brabham, 8 points behind. The 1970 British Grand Prix was held at Brands Hatch to the south of London. Among the shapely noses lined up for practice, there was a newcomer. John Surtees' team, based near Brands Hatch, had completed work on his new car and it was ready for its first race. There was a new driver too. Alongside the established stars like Stewart in his new Dunlop overalls and Mario Andretti back in a March after a gap of 4 races, there was a young Brazilian named Emerson Fittipaldi, being given his first chance in Formula 1 in a now outdated Lotus 49. The inboard brakes on Jochen Rindt's new Lotus 72 needed special coolers, but Jack Brabham only needed to worry about tyre temperatures. The cars that lined up for this race, which marked the halfway point of the season, represented an interesting mix of design philosophies. The Lotus 72 represented the future, with its radical concept of moving the radiators to the sides of the car and making the nose as slim and aerodynamic as possible. The Ferrari 312, on the other hand, in terms of its chassis at least, represented the past, for the body was still a tubular frame rather than a one-piece monocoque. The strength of the red cars lay in their powerful flat 12 engine. The rest of the field represented the state of the art, with monocoque bodies and front-mounted radiators in cars that expressed each individual designer's idea of the ideal racing machine. In terms of performance, however, there was little between them, a fact proved by the front row of the grid. The driver's parade was in vintage Jaguars, but the first row of the grid was a cross-section of current Formula 1 design. It was made up of Jochen Rindt's futuristic Lotus, Jack Brabham's own conventional design, and Jackie Ickx's outdated but powerful Ferrari. It was Jackie Ickx who took the advantage from the start, ahead of Brabham and Rindt. Stewart was fourth, ahead of Eamon and Surtees. It was a closely matched battle that had the crowd on its feet. After 6 laps, however, the Ferrari was out with transmission trouble and Rindt slipped past Brabham to take over the lead. Further back in the field, the Lotus 49 was still a competitive car, as Graham Hill and American Pete Lovely showed. Hill would go on to finish 6th. The speeds and the temperature were hard on engines, but the Cosworths in the leading cars, which included Holmes' McLaren after Oliver's BRM retired, showed no sign of giving up. On lap 68, with just a dozen to go, Brabham's pressure on Rindt finally paid off, and the veteran Australian went into the lead. Victory looked certain, but then the same ill luck that had struck Brabham in Monaco visited him again. In the very last lap, his engine stuttered for lack of fuel. Once again, the Austrian flew past him with the flag virtually in sight, and Brabham rolled across the line to the sound of sympathetic applause. With the season at its midpoint, Rindt was establishing a useful championship lead. Poor Jack Brabham, who'd seen 2 certain wins turn into second place behind the Austrian youngster, had every right to feel frustrated. But for fate, he would have been 1 point ahead. 1970 was the first year in which the German Grand Prix was held at the Hockenheim circuit near Heidelberg. The change from its traditional home, the Nürburgring, was at the insistence of the drivers, who said that they would not drive on the ring unless crash barriers were erected along its entire 14-mile length. Hockenheim had been used for other races, but for many of the Formula One drivers, this was their first visit to the circuit with its unique format. The fastest part of the track ran through forest, where there were no spectator facilities, but a twisting stadium section, where the pits and the start and finish were located, held over 150,000 fans. The mass of humanity in the stands could provide a wall of sound as loud as that in the biggest football stadium. During practice, when the attendance was smaller, the atmosphere was relaxed, but on race day, with a full house, Hockenheim would be a pressure cooker. The nature of the track, with flat-out runs into the forest and out again, put an emphasis on power and high-speed aerodynamics. The 12-cylinder cars could be expected to have an advantage here, and everyone was running rear wings that were trimmed for speed rather than grip. In the case of Swiss driver Silvio Moser, perhaps there was not enough grip. Moser was driving the Bellassi, a car he had commissioned from an Italian manufacturer. It was not successful. Entered in 5 races in 1970, it qualified for only 1. Among the more successful teams, V12 Ferrari power paid off, putting Ickx on pole and Regazzoni third. Second place was held by the sleek Lotus of Rindt, while the marches of Siffert and Eamon had Pescarolo's V12 Matra between them. Stewart was further back than usual, on the 4th row. As the flag fell, Rindt was almost swamped, but he recovered, and at the end of the first lap, he was second behind Ickx. First of the top contenders to retire was Brabham, out after only 5 laps with an oil leak. 10 laps later, Regazzoni was spinning out with a seized gearbox, but Ickx, in the number 1 Ferrari, was still battling ferociously for the lead with Rindt. While the speed and the heat took their toll and other drivers walked home, the Ferrari and the Lotus ran neck and neck, swapping the lead no less than 5 times in the last 10 laps and whipping the stadium crowd into a frenzy. At the flag, it was Rindt who crossed the line first, beating Ickx by a mere 7/10 of a second. It had been the most exciting race of the season so far, and it consolidated Rindt's lead in the championship table. After Hockenheim, the Formula One circus moved on to yet another new venue, the Österreichring. The circuit, a little over 3.5 miles long, threaded through the hills near Zeltweg, the airfield circuit that had been the cradle of post-war racing in Austria. The surroundings were beautiful countryside, and the atmosphere was a cross between a country fair and a top-line motor race. Frank Williams was back, with Australian Tim Schenken taking the place of the much-lamented Piers Courage in the De Tomaso. It was Schenken's first Grand Prix. But for fellow Aussie Jack Brabham, it was his 122nd. Gethin and Diadimich were in McLarens, the latter with Alpha Power. Joe Siffert and Mario Andretti were both March mounted. Pescarolo and Beltoise were in the Matra Simcas, still full of promise but lacking results, despite the work of their engineers. Colin Chapman, convinced of Emerson Fittipaldi's potential, was giving the young Brazilian another run in the Lotus 49. Although Jochen Rindt took pole position to the delight of his home crowd, after practice it was the Ferrari pits that were full of confidence. At the beginning of the season, the team had entered just one car for X. Here in Austria there were three, for the Belgian, Regazzoni and Giunti, and all three were in the top 5 qualifiers. Regazzoni was alongside Rindt on the front row, X ahead of Stewart on row 2, and Giunti 5th ahead of Eamon's March. The prancing horse was on form and ready to race. Right from the start, this was Ferrari's day. Regazzoni led the first lap, but then X passed him to take control. It was not a good day for Tyrrell. Both blue cars hit trouble on the first lap. Sever retired immediately, while Stewart made a pit stop. Repairs were only temporary, however, and he had to retire 7 laps later. The combination of traffic in the pits, officious local police and the Italian temperament of Ferrari engineer Foghieri was a volatile mixture. The situation wasn't helped when John Miles brought his Lotus in to retire after only 5 laps. It was a bad omen, for on lap 22 Rindt's engine blew and he pulled in by the pits. The local hero had to walk home to the despair of the crowds. On lap 35, Brabham, who'd been running 5th, pulled into the pits after a stone punctured his radiator. In a magnificent team effort, his mechanics fitted a new one and sent him back into the race within 5 minutes. There was some consolation for the Brabham team when Stommelen took 3rd place after Beltoise, who'd chased the Ferraris throughout the race, had to stop for fuel with just 3 laps to go. The triumph, however, went to Ferrari, with X and Regazzoni finishing 1st and 2nd and recording identical fastest laps on the same lap to share the lap record. With the win in Austria, expectations were high for Ferrari at their home Grand Prix at Monza, where, as usual, the sun shone brightly. Graham Hill had a new Lotus 72 for the race, but this was a circuit where the V12 engines of BRM, Matra and Ferrari should have the advantage. At the beginning of the season, Ken Tyrrell had realised the March would be outclassed and had laid secret plans to build his own car. It made its first appearance here, but only in practice. It was not yet ready to race. McLaren had Gethin and Hulme in works cars, Bonnier in a private entry, and Italian Nanni Galli in a second Alfa-engined car. But Bonnier and Galli both failed to qualify. Ronnie Peterson was having a difficult season in his March and could only qualify 13th. For Lotus, however, things were going very well. Jochen Rindt was leading the championship with 5 wins. For team boss Colin Chapman and Jochen's wife Nina, the pressure was off here. But then, out of the blue, tragedy struck. During Saturday afternoon's practice session, as the Austrian braked from 200 miles an hour into the parabolica curve, a mechanical failure sent the car into the guardrail. Help was on hand instantly, but Rindt's injuries were too severe. He died in the ambulance on the way to hospital. The other Lotus 72s were withdrawn from the race, and a sense of deep shock settled over the paddock. Jochen Rindt had been one of the most popular drivers on the scene, and none of his friends and fellow drivers wanted to race, but they knew they must. Among those present, none knew better than Enzo Ferrari the cost of racing in human lives. At the start, Commendatore Ferrari had 3 of his cars in the first 5, with Ickx best placed on pole position. One of his former drivers, John Surtees, was less fortunate. He stalled his engine and was left stranded on the line. Although Ickx led from the start, it was not a case of Ferrari domination. In a typical Monza race, where a group of drivers would slipstream each other and grab an advantage wherever they could, Ickx, Rodriguez, Stewart and Regazzoni all held first place at some point. Over the 68 laps, the lead changed 28 times. Ickx retired after 26 laps, and Regazzoni, in only his 5th Grand Prix, established his position ahead of Stewart and Beltoise. Sensing victory, the crowd went wild, but the world of Grand Prix racing had little to celebrate. Rindt's total of 45 points meant Formula One could have its first posthumous world champion. In 1970, the Canadian round of the World Championship was held at the Saint-Gervais-Mont-Tremblant circuit, and as usual, it was cool enough for John Surtees to welcome a warm drink. Graham Hill had his new Lotus ready to race, but the factory cars were absent. Clay Regazzoni and Ickx represented Ferrari, and Rolf Stommelen was backing up Jack Brabham. But the Canadian